Good morning. This is lecture 2 for the site translation for court interpreters from English into Spanish. During lecture 1, we looked at the concept of instability and how terms could be unstable at different times, and what to do with those particular cases. We also we didn't do that many site readings simply because we spent a lot of time doing learning those basic principles that are so important in this class, as well as in overall in interpreting. And you may or may not remember, but we discussed how certain terms are unstable and even the degree of those terms, which basically the degree changes depending on the number of possible transfers into the opposite language. It's kind of a dynamic process because as you grow and learn more about some of these terms and you do some research, you realize that these terms can be used in more different ways. So for example, if you look at the term office, so far we really have considered it as an unstable term of the third degree because it can transfer into Spanish as oficina, it can transfer as consultorio médico, or it can transfer as bufete jurídico. And within those three transfers, bufete jurídico, for example, has its own synonyms, and therefore that doesn't mean that there are more degrees of instability. In fact, the degrees are only 3. But you may have in one of them, like in law office, excuse me, you may have bufete jurídico, estudio jurídico, despacho, and those are synonyms, so they are not considered to be any additional degree of instability. In fact, they are pretty stable and they are synonyms. We did mention that whenever you have a term that is basically has 2 or 3 possible translations and they are both correct, then we say that those particular terms, that term is stable, but it has many options. So for example, you remember from the very first class, acquittal, you could have absolución, exoneración. They are synonyms, and therefore this would be a stable term, but it has two possible transfers into the opposite language. So the idea of stability and instability and all that becomes really, really important in order to properly comprehend why we shouldn't really transfer words without paying attention to the message. We did mention that any term that is unstable becomes stable once you know context, right? So if you look at the word office, oficina, consultorio médico, bufete jurídico, it's pretty unstable. You don't know which one it is. But as soon as you say law office, that makes the term stable. So law office is stable, but office by itself is not. And this shows the importance of context in the transfers. And that's why it's always, you will always hear that an interpreter does not transfer words, but transfers messages. That's an important concept that you should always keep in mind. Now, we did not look at what we call partial instability, which we will be looking at it perhaps next week. And just to give you an example, a partial stability means that under certain circumstances, in certain jurisdictions, under certain conditions, the term is stable. But under other conditions, the term may become unstable. If you look, for example, at the term acquittal, you have absolución y exoneración. They are synonyms, and therefore one could consider that the term acquittal transfers is a stable term and has 2 possible transfers that they are both synonyms, and that is correct. The problem that happens in this particular case, or in the case of partial stability, is that for a term to be fully stable, it has to go from one direction and then come back from the other direction. In other words, if I have law office, bufete jurídico, when I hear bufete jurídico, I will say law office. In the case of acquittal, on the other hand, from English into Spanish is quite stable, and it has 2 different synonyms, absolución, exoneración. But when you go from Spanish into English, the word absolución, that word just by itself, is certainly stable, but exoneración may not be, because exonerar could be to acquit, but it also could be to release of any responsibilities. Therefore, we can see here the concept of partial stability. Partial stability is defined as stability in one direction and lack thereof in the opposite direction. And in this particular case, it only happens with one of the synonyms. And this is why sometimes, or quite often I should say, I tell students it's better to use this term than to use this term. You may remember when I explained the translation of the term crime into Spanish. I said you could use crimen, and that's certainly correct, but there has to be a condition associated with it. And that condition was that the crime has to be a felony. But we like to use delito because it works at all times. Now, this thing of saying it works at all times, the proper way or the formal way of saying this is we want you to use delito because delito is a fully stable transfer for the term crime. It means it works at all times. When we look at crimen, you have to be extremely careful because you could only use it if the crime that it was committed is a felony, and therefore there is that partial stability with one of the terms is stable, but with the other one it's not really stable. So all these concepts are important because in a way it summarizes everything that you have been learning. I mean, you have many options throughout this training that I push for one term, one transfer, and sometimes students come back and they say, can I use this, can I use that? And it's hard to say no because sometimes you cannot use it, or you can only use it on under certain conditions. But the reason why I always push for one term is because I want the job of the interpreter to be stable throughout, meaning that I want the interpreter to be able to transfer terms that are completely stable throughout the interpretation. I don't want the interpreter to be thinking, oh, wait a minute, this is an unstable term, I gotta do this, and this may not work, it's just unnecessary. So whenever I push for a particular transfer, that means that I'm pushing for a full stability transfer in both directions, which is really what I want to have as an interpreter as well as a translator. So keep that in mind because this is something that we're going to be discussing eventually more in detail. In preparation for the next course, because the next course, which is Spanish into English, you're gonna start wondering, wait a minute, when we use English sight and we saw these words with this particular word, we said that it was stable and it transferred that correctly into Spanish. Now we see this word in Spanish, and when we transfer into English, we see that it is unstable. How could that be? And this is where the concept of full or partial stability comes into play. Full stability is microphone, micrófono, micrófono, microphone. No doubt about that. Partial stability is acquittal, exoneración, but when you go from exoneración back into English, you may have acquittal as one option, but you could also have release, exonerar de una responsabilidad, to release someone from any responsibility. So that's where the concept becomes very important. So we should, from now on, refer to or somehow indicate that it is fully stable or it is partially stable. However, from English into Spanish, you have usually more stability than from Spanish into English, and we will see that that's why that sight translation is more difficult, and that's why that class is more difficult than this one. So last week, and I will need some help from you, I believe that we started with one sight translation, which is, I believe, I'm not sure, but I believe that we started with this site. I don't know if we did this site or which site, but I believe it was this one. So can I get some help, please, on which site we did last week? I believe it was this one, but I don't think we finished it, if I'm not mistaken. We were only looking at some levels of instability and things of that nature. We're doing kind of an analysis of this site, but we didn't actually do the rendition of this site. Keep in mind that today we're going to look less to the academic portion of this and more into the rendition portion of it. And by that I mean that we're going to be doing a lot more site. The third one, thank you, Kimberly. Yeah, that's the one after number 2. Now, did we finish the whole thing, or did I do the rendition for you? Did I do the site translation for you, or I did not do that? Do you recall that? Can you check your notes, please? Because I need to complete this site translation before we move on to others. So the plan today, while I get some feedback from you as to how much we covered, the plan today is to do as many sites as we can. So it's very possible we're going to do the first paragraph. Thank you very much, Marina. We did the first paragraph. I did the rendition of the first paragraph. Okay, very good. So the plan today is to do as many sites as possible and kind of mention when I deliver it some ideas about the term being stable, but but it is more like getting sites done. Pay close attention to my choice of words in some of the renditions, and if I believe that you may have a different option, then that's when we will be discussing stability. See, stability is a concept that it is used mainly to justify your transfers. And when you have an option and I got to tell you, no, you don't use it in this particular sentence, then I got to explain why you don't use it in that particular sentence. So having said that, let's just dwell into site translation number 3, which you actually see on the screen. I'm going to try to always put the site translations on the screens from now on. And we did do number 1, so paragraph number 1. But I'm going to do the whole site translation. But before we do that, I'm going to analyze some of these words that appear on the second paragraph. Because I believe what we did last week is I did go over an analysis of the words and then I rendered the paragraph. But we didn't actually do any analysis of the words on paragraph 2 and 3. So we're going to do that next. So when you look at this second one, which says defendant claims on appeal, the first thing that comes to my mind when I look at this is the verb to claim. And when I look at the verb to claim, I know for a fact that that is going to be an unstable term, a very unstable term, as a matter of fact. In fact, the reason why the verb claim is unstable is because you have 2 possible options as a verb, right? Reclamar, so this is instability of the second degree. Afirmar. There are more levels of instability, but these are the 2 ones that tend to appear in the criminal jurisdiction. If we add the civil, I can add one more, which is demandar. But don't worry about it. Just use these 2. So the problem here is that they are not synonyms. You know, when I say, for example, the defendant claims that, you can say el acusado reclamó que, because in Spanish reclamar indicates that you are claiming something that you are entitled to receive. So this term is generally used in administrative hearings. Administrative hearings are those hearings that many of you will be interpreting. There's a lot of work. It has to do with workers' compensation most of the times. But this is where the injured worker claims benefits, reclama sus prestaciones o sus beneficios. And it really, this reclamar is really very rarely the option for the term, for the transfer of the verb claim. in criminal matters. We always like to use afirmar. So when you look at so this is the one that we use at all time. Particularly, the way that I determine if it's stable or unstable is if it is in criminal jurisdiction, es afirmar. But if it is in administrative jurisdiction, it is reclamar. So very rarely in the criminal jurisdiction, you will see the verb to claim as reclamar. And therefore, that's why in our option, here we have defendant claims on appeal, el acusado afirma en la apelación that he was forced to waive his right. Okay, so here comes an interesting term, force. There is this concept that we briefly discussed last week, but didn't get into it too much, of what we call interference. And an interference is nothing else than anything that you bring from the original language into the target language. And that includes the structure, he has a red car, él tiene un rojo automóvil. If you do that, that's an interference from the original language. But it also includes words that are similar, that don't necessarily apply, although the word may exist in Spanish, but it doesn't apply to the context in which that word is being used. And in this particular case, when we look at he was forced to waive his rights, we have an issue. We don't have an issue of stability or lack thereof. What we do have an issue here is on the interference from the original language into the target language, particularly with the verb to force. So many people or many interpreters will say, who are studying to become interpreters, will say, él fue forzado. Well, in Spanish, we use forzar when you force an object. Forzar una puerta, forzar una ventana, that might be used. But for a person, we use obligado. So you can see here that is the term forced to force unstable? Well, technically it is, because we have two options, forzar y obligar. And forzar only applies to objects, obligar applies only to individuals, people. But that lack of stability comes from the interference of English into Spanish, and the use of, in this case, it will be interference in terms of false cognates, use of a term or a transfer that sounds similar to the original, but it doesn't mean the same thing, not necessarily in that context at least. And therefore, it is an unstable term, but because of interference, which really brings up an interesting point that we will discuss as well in this course. There are many terms that are unstable simply because of interferences from the original language into the target language. And this is where the interpreter is nothing else than a filter of those interferences. And the more knowledge the interpreter has, the more filter the interpreter possesses. If I read a lot in Spanish, I probably will realize that I never read a José lo forzaron. I did read forzaron la puerta, forzaron la puerta del automóvil, but I probably will not see anything like a José lo forzaron, because it just doesn't sound right? I haven't read it many times, and therefore, because I haven't read it, and I have a lot of filters because I read a lot in Spanish, therefore I can determine that he was forced cannot be él fue forzado. So I automatically wonder what will be the right translation, and at that time, if you read a lot, you probably realize fue obligado is the proper option. This process that you are doing as an interpreter is based on the amount of filters that you have, which basically it means nothing else than training, education, and personal research on words and how words are used and so on and so forth. So that's why training is so important. And always training, when I always talk about training, I mean, I love everybody to take classes with me. That's excellent. I love that. but you have to have training from different people because everybody brings something else to your training, right? And we concentrate on certain things. I may be kind of picky in the legal terms, in the transfers and this and that. There might be someone else who brings more into the equation in terms of idiomatic expressions or maybe slang. So you benefit from training with different people generally. Of course, instructors that are well known in the interpreting world don't, because otherwise it can confuse you tremendously, right? So there are not necessarily that many out there that will not confuse you, but it's important that the training is with somebody who is well known in the industry. But forget about that portion of it. Let's talk a little bit about this idea of the interference. So what you do when you train, you create filters, and when you see something then that it is in English and you want to transfer it into Spanish, then you realize you have sufficient filters to identify that this doesn't sound right. Translators do this all the time. They translate a document, give it to someone else, and then the other person may come back and say, this sentence doesn't sound right. It means that the one who says that has more filters than the one who translated it originally when it comes to that particular aspect of the transfer. So in this particular scenario, your knowledge brings stability to the equation, really, if you think about it. And that's why it's so important. So there's nothing more dangerous than someone who wants to become interpreter, who doesn't read, who doesn't do any research on his or her own, who thinks that he or she knows everything, and who doesn't accept suggestions. It's just a mixture for failure, because we all know, I am still learning, after 35 years, 40 years doing this. So you have to be open to that learning process, because what that brings to you is new tools. We call it filters in the industry, but really they are tools to actually filter those interferences that come from one language into the other, English into Spanish. Most of you are starting this profession, and it's actually important that I, as an instructor, and you pick me as your initial instructor, I appreciate that very much, but it is very important that I actually make sure that you understand that this is interpreting is, you never know everything in interpreting. It's a learning process, and every time, every month, every year, every day, you're learning something new. But when you learn something, don't just memorize this is this. Try to comprehend why forzar is not going to be the best option here. It should be more obligar in this case. Try to understand why the verb to dismiss is better transferred into legal Spanish as sobreseer instead of terms such as anular, terms such as, I've seen so many different interesting terms. Dejar sin efecto, they sound very fancy, but they don't mean the same thing. I've seen, for example, desestimar, which that will only probably could be used in the dismissal of a request for an appeal, desestimar una apelación. So try to learn why, and that's why I push this class, I use it mainly to really prepare you to be a really good professional. And to be a good professional as an interpreter, you need to put some effort into it. And I'm sure, I know that this is a really good class. You're all very interested in this. I monitor you frequently. I know that you're pretty good at this. Some of you need to do a little more work still on the judge's bench cut and stuff like that. But overall, it's a really good class. So this is what I'm feeding you right now, is something that you are receiving. And that's going to make a difference. So let's just go back. I'm a little bit off track here, but let's go back into the actual issue of interference and how interference and instability plays a role here. Many times, the target language and the original language, they don't match. It happens in Spanish, not as often as it could happen in other languages. But when I say they don't match, I mean that the structures might be different. I mean that, for example, certain words that sound similar do not convey the same meaning. So we can have like these lexical interferences, the structural interferences. We can have so many of these things. And what's important for us is to understand that there is a potential of an interference. And then if we don't know it, what should the right transfer should be, then obviously we're going to do the research on it. If you already know it, then that's actually perfect. These interferences may happen it may be reversible or irreversible. What that means is that you may have an interference from English into Spanish, but you may not have that interference from Spanish into English. Just to give you an example. If I say she was embarrassed, and you say in Spanish, ella estaba embarazada, the interference here is based on lexical interference. It's based specifically on the use of the term embarrassed, and it has to do specifically with a false cognate, two words that sound similar in the original and the target language, but they don't mean the same. When you look at if you see the same sentence in Spanish, ella estaba embarazada, most likely it's not going to, in your mind, you're not going to be thinking that the transfer is she was embarrassed. Most likely, you're going to transfer that to another term, but not embarrassed. Yet, so you can see that the interference is from English into Spanish when it comes to this example. Yet, it does create a problem. But it creates a problem in one direction, English into Spanish. And since we're working on the English into Spanish sight readings, this is what we're going to concentrate on. And the reason why English into Spanish tends to be the main interference, lexical interference as far as false cognates are concerned, is the fact that we live in the US. And we have less filters from Latin America. What it means is that we don't read in Spanish that much. As a result of it, we are here in the US, and therefore we are more prone to use false cognates when they go into Spanish. If you learn, let's say that we are talking to an interpreter, mainly an interpreter in Latin America, it is very possible that their main interference is from Spanish into English, that they will pick a similar word to transfer something like this. So, for example, let me give you an example, a legal example. Registro civil, it's possible that they will say registrar's office, which is not completely incorrect, but we know that in the United States, that's going to be more like county recorder's office. So this lack of immersion in the culture that corresponds to the target language is what actually creates these interferences. We need to be aware of it, but we also need to be concerned about the one that you will be facing in your state exam, because here's another problem. The state exam tests you in both directions, and but you're more prone to use false cognates from English into Spanish than Spanish into English. So we need to concentrate specifically on that area. Now, the sight translation from Spanish into English, or any sight translation in any interpreting exam from Spanish into English, will have its own problems. But the main problems from English into Spanish always tend to be the use of false cognates, and the false cognates are not only in terms of regular terminology. Quite often it could be on legal terminology. I'm not sure if the state exam includes a lot of legal terms in the sight from English into Spanish. I would assume it's full of legal terms, because when we work in the courts, that's basically what we do. We transfer lots of legal things. You have seen those forms, advisement of rights, waiver and plea forms, and things like that. So I'm sure that there are a lot of those legal terms. And therefore, you need to be very precise in terms of the use of those legal terms, right? And that's why when I do these sites here, just make sure that you follow the transfers that I give you, and I will give you the explanation why it is right and why the other one is wrong, and I'll give you all sort of formal explanations and all that stuff. But if you're not interested about those explanations, then at least make sure you use it in that context. I have to say that if you don't understand why, then you are prone to make that mistake in future readings, simply because this is a dynamic process, and a word by itself is not dynamic, it's static. But when you put other words around it, then you make it, the interaction of all these words create a new entity with a lot of pieces that are very, very dynamic.